Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. Yes, before you ask, I am still working on that Byzantine Civ overview that I promised. I've just had a couple of questions concerning markets that people have left, and I thought I'd try to put them all together into one big comprehensive video that looks at the math of how the markets work. My aim in this video is to give you the info that you need to make optimal choices in-game around using the market, as well as to satisfy general interest. I'll be covering a little bit of everything that was asked for, from the market distance formula, the effects of a cluttered trade route, trade carts versus trade cogs, how the buying and selling options work, and how guilds and Saracens bonus play into that, as well as how having markets destroyed can disrupt your trade route. I realize you may not be interested in all of that stuff, so I'll show the times that jump to the different topics so that if there's something you're looking for in particular, you can find it quickly. As you can tell though, there's lots to cover in this video, so let's get started. So like I said, the first topic of this video is going to be the market distance formula. First, before we can find that though, let's try to find out where we're measuring from. I did a little check of symmetry of the markets and how much gold is generated around them, and at first I thought the point it measures is from the bottom of the market. That's important because if we're measuring distance, we're not measuring from the same place as the developers are, our formulas are going to be really weird. You can see from this test that the markets are equidistant apart, and the point at the top is worth 5 gold, whereas the other corners are worth 4. This is why I first thought that it was measuring from the bottom of the market. After a second test though, it looks like there's no asymmetry issues, and it's probably measuring from the closest side of the market to the closest side of the other market, if that makes sense. I still can't explain the 5 gold versus 4 gold in the first test, but there you go. I'll assume based on this test, it's okay to do my measurements using the shortest distance between the markets instead of measuring from one particular corner to the other. Another quick check that I did confirms that the gold generated is determined by the distance between the markets as the crow flies, and not by the actual route length. The cart can take a long time to reach the market, as we can see in this video with the really long river dividing them, and it still only gets 2 gold per trip if the coordinates of the markets are beside each other on the map. Okay, so now that we have some of that groundwork out of the way, let's get on to the actual question. Of course, we all know that the payoff from a trade route goes up if the route is longer. Each of these markets is placed so that there's an extra 16 tiles further than the last. Each market is, of course, a 4x4 square, and we're measuring from the closest distance between the red markets and my blue one. Doubling the distance between the markets more than doubles the amount of gold you get for the trip, and the trip does in fact take exactly twice as long. As you can see, 7 times the distance yields around 18 times the gold. I realize there's some rounding error going on here with the 3 gold market, and right now I'm just bringing attention to that general trend. It's easy to see there's a better payoff as the trade route distance increases. This has become pretty common knowledge among people who play the game, and you often see markets put as far away from each other as is safely possible. The question I see sometimes is, does this mean the distance and gold relationship is linear, or is the function a squared one? If it's linear with an intercept of 0 gold for 0 distance, twice as far should give twice as much gold. But there could also be a certain distance before the calculation starts. So maybe the first 20 tiles you don't get any gold, and then after that it's linear. That could also explain why there's more than double the payoff for doubling the distance, although we would expect that effect to become smaller as our distances become farther. We'll keep that possibility in the back of our minds, but it seems like a weird way to do it from the developer's point of view. If, on the other hand, the relationship is a square one, then doubling the distance should lead to 4 times the gold. So what do we actually see? Well, we actually see neither of those things. It's something in the middle. So just eyeballing it, it seems to be about when you double the distance, you get 3 times the gold, or something like that. The increased gold payoff is some exponential function, in that the payoff gets bigger, but it doesn't get bigger as fast as a squared relationship does. This makes calculating the formula a lot harder, and it probably won't look nice. The way to do it then is we're going to have to try a bunch of different market distances and graph the relationship, find a curve that fits the data, and then determine the equation of the line. Yeah. So I got to it, and I tested this using a ludicrous map size. That's a map size that you only have in the Forgotten Empires expansion, and is only really good for things like this. So then what I did is I lined up a bunch of markets along the edge, and I found the tile length of a market and the plotting distance versus the gold yield, and then I found the equation that fit this the best. The reason I used the largest map size was to give the highest confidence that we're fitting the curve properly. One thing I noticed is that the amount of gold increase from one market to the next kept going up. Early on, a lot of the markets, as you go from one to the next, would increase by usually 1 gold, and then as you went on, then it became more commonly 2 gold, and then 3 and 4. Anyway, once I recorded the gold from all of these markets and I put it into a spreadsheet, I deleted the furthest one and moved all of the markets up 1 tile, then did the whole thing again, recorded them all. I'm a thorough guy, and this let me be even more confident that my line of best fit is matching the gold curve that we see in the game. So, looking at the market distance versus gold, I played around with the degree of the function and whether it had an intercept of 0 or not. It really seemed pretty obvious to me looking at the candidate equations that it's a second degree function, and it seems like it would be unnecessarily complicated if the programmers decide to make an intercept that wasn't 0, especially when it looks so close to 0. Okay, so it didn't work out perfectly, but my guess here of the equation that I found is 0.001x squared plus 0.1353x, where x is the number of tile lengths measuring directly from the closest edge of each market to each other. Supposedly, this has an r squared of 1, which is the correlation. So that means that the trend line correlates perfectly with the data. I think it's probably rounding a little bit there, to be honest, and it's probably more like 0.999 or something like that. But it's obviously a really close fit, which I'm happy about. On the other hand, I know this is slightly wrong, or I've approached it a bit wrong, because when I test it, there's actually a bit of gold generated when the two markets are directly beside each other and actually touching, where my formula would predict 0. Therefore, I have to go back to our original assumption, and I think the distance it's measuring is obviously not from the closest edge of the markets to each other, and it's from some other point on the market, probably within the market's 16 tiles. This isn't a big deal, but admittedly, there is some error here somewhere. I didn't think this was worth investigating though, because we have the general trend of the formula already and a pretty close approximation. Because I was feeling a little bit iffy about it now, I tried to confirm the formula online, but after checking around I found this is a bit of an unresolved and open question in the community. That's not to say that I'm the only one that's tried to do something like this, but there just doesn't seem to be a consensus on what the formula is. Understandably, most people also don't care what the formula is beyond the fact that longer trade routes mean more gold. I'd agree with this sentiment, and don't worry about the formula, just build markets far apart. If you're like me though, and you're just curious what the formula is just to know, I think this one's pretty close. I'm not super happy with the x value of the formula because it doesn't really seem to have any significance as far as I can tell. Its inverse isn't a square root or anything like that, and it just seems like a random number. I was expecting and hoping for something a little bit more elegant, I suppose. One thing this does tell us though is that the trade routes can be more efficient as the map size increases. Extra time spent traveling between markets pays in greater yields over time. So I compiled these results that I found through a little bit of experimentation for the maximum route possible along one side and diagonally across the map for all of the different map sizes. The yellow line represents the trade route, and the number beside it represents the gold obtained from that route. Okay, so next question. I wanted to know how the game handles what I call the diagonal tile problem with trade routes. So I've never seen this brought up in my video's comments or anywhere else, and I feel like it's a hugely important question. So Age of Empires works with square tiles that we're viewing from an angle, and maybe determining that exact angle could even be a future video, who knows. The tiles that we're looking at, they look like diamonds because of our vantage point, right? And straight lines to the units in the game look like diagonals to us. But a right diamond is just a square on its side, so the same geometry applies to it. One thing you may have forgotten from geometry class is that the diagonal length along a square is root 2 times longer than along one of its sides, which is about 1.414 times as long. So what, right? Well, depending on how Age of Empires has programmed units to move and how it counts distances between markets, that could mean it takes 41% longer for a trade cart to do a route that requires taking the long way across the tile versus going along the tile on the shorter sides. Are you starting to see what I mean? I'm probably not explaining it very well. Hopefully Age of Empires knows about this and you don't have to think about it because it's already counting the diagonal length on the tile as being longer anyway. In order to test this, we can extrapolate from the curve that we've already made and see how it compares to observation. Since the ludicrous map is square, a market on the far corner should be about 1.414 times as far as a market on one of the left or right corners. Looking at them, it looks like it's 517 gold for when they're completely across the map from each other on opposite corners, and 278 when they're on two corners that are closer together. This sounds about right, but let's check. So we should be able to work backward from that and find that root 2 ratio. So following the 517-ish gold means it should be about 660-ish tiles diagonally across the map between the markets. We already know that 278 gold was from the markets being 472 tiles away, and as it turns out, we get a 1.39831 ratio from working backwards. There was enough error and approximation there, plus the fact that I don't know if our curve formula is exact, that I'm satisfied Age of Empires is taking the diagonal distance into account. That means you don't have to worry about your trade routes following the grid lines on Age of Empires, and anywhere you place them, it seems like it can figure it out using a little bit of trigonometry if it has to. Good job, developers. That being said, it was a little bit lower, so if you really want to play it safe, you could follow those diagonal lines a little bit more closely. Okay, so the next question I was wondering is how the Spanish bonus works. Do they just see markets as having 33% more gold, or do they carry 33% more gold than the market advertises? Well, that was a super easy one. Basically, they just see the market as having 33% more, so they therefore carry 33% more. Cool, next. Okay, so one thing I want to point out is that the display on the market is a rounded number, but that number isn't actually being rounded in the calculations. This means technically you can get gold with two markets right beside each other if the cart makes a lot of trips. Each time they collect a fraction of gold. I would imagine this is happening for the bigger numbers too, but that effect would be pretty small. Now what I want to know is, where is this decimal being kept track of? Is it the actual trade cart itself that's keeping track of that? Is it the market that's keeping track of that? Or is it your stockpile of gold that's keeping track of that? In order to see if it was the actual trade carts themselves, I had one cart that did the trip 3 times, and on the next one it should have given me 1 gold. So instead I delete that trade cart and I have another one come in. If that trade cart I deleted was keeping track of the fractions, then when the next one should come in, it should have to do 4 trips in order to get up to 1 gold. This isn't what we see. Trade carts are therefore not remembering the fractions. So then, I did the same thing, except after the 3 trips I destroyed the market and I built a new one. And again, it took 1 more trip to get up to the 1 gold, which means the market was not keeping track of the fractions of gold. As far as I can tell, there's some hidden info that the game keeps to itself about how many resources you have in your stockpile, and you don't actually get to see that because of rounding. No one asked that question, I just kind of wanted to know. So to recap stuff so far, build your markets far apart, don't worry about diagonal routes, and the Spanish are awesome. Okay, so that's all great in theory, but let's take a look at a real game situation and examine the effects of a cluttered trade route. So remember that the game doesn't care how far the trade cart journey was, just the distance between the markets matters. If your trade cart has to weave through every building and every unit you have, that's only going to slow it down and reduce its yield. Some people pay attention to this, and some people and computers don't. So let's see how big of a difference it actually makes. This is one of those questions though that I could make an hour-long video testing all the different possible scenarios, or I could just make a few examples and show you the kind of scale that we're dealing with. Are we talking about cluttered routes dropping a manageable 5% in trade income, or could this be up to 80%? The scale is what we're interested in, not the exact situation, all the different scenarios you can run into. So bearing in mind that I can't foresee all the types of obstructions you crazy players can run your carts into, let's try a few scenarios. First, let's establish a baseline with an optimal trade route. It takes 70 seconds per trip with no obstruction in this particular trade route. Okay, so now let's add a few obstacles, maybe a few buildings and the like, leaving some space for the cart to still slip through easily. Now, it takes 73 seconds for him to make the trip. Pretty much the same, really. He weaves around a little bit, but he's really not that bad at finding his way through. If we had to try and quantify it, maybe every little course correction he makes adds about half a second to the route. Okay, so now let's take it a step further, and let's add a bunch of lumberjacks, farmers, and buildings like this is a really busy city. This slowed him down considerably, down to 84 seconds, which is 20% longer than the first run. Obviously little random effects are going to occur and pathing issues and stuff, but it's really not that bad so far, and we can say 20%, maybe that's typical for a sort of busy town like the one that you're seeing here. Okay, so now let's do it again and step things up a notch. Now we have a bunch of trade carts in the mix too, and we're just going to follow one of these trade carts here. This time it took him 101 seconds. That's 44% longer than when it was a clear trade route. It's easy to see how a town could even be worse than this one for obstruction too. Okay, so just to take it up one more level, now let's put lots of gates and more trade carts into the mix, like a really defensive late game in Black Forest. Well, this one's going to take a while. Okay, so here's the point. Trade carts get you the same gold regardless of how long it takes them to do the trip. So help them out and give them a straight route with as few obstructions as you can. Adding buildings, other trade carts, and especially gates in their way make the route less efficient. Theoretically, there's even a point, depending on the route, where more trade carts leads to roadblocks and brings down your efficiency. We could probably summarize it also by saying there's a bit of a threshold effect, and your first few obstacles are relatively minor, but as you add more buildings, there's a certain point that we hit that it begins to take a much bigger toll. It's probably worth keeping trade route congestion in mind, even though I realize that's hard to do when you're building the markets. It's hard to see that far ahead in the game, but it really is worth the couple seconds to think about where you can put the carts so that they won't be moving right through the middle of your base, and especially through unnecessary gates. Okay, so now let's talk about new markets along your trade route and when you're trading with multiple markets. Okay, so first let's assume your ally builds a new market somewhere along the route. Is that going to take down the amount of gold that you get from all of your other routes? So in this test, I had a cart trading with a far market, and I made a trigger so that a new closer market is created when I deleted the house. We'll see what effect the new market has on the trade route in a before and after comparison. Well, it turns out the game isn't easily confused when you build a new market. It sees each one as an independent trade route. There's no rule that building closer markets makes all the markets worth less gold. Trade carts also won't switch routes if there's a new market made automatically. You can see in this video that the trade cart on the route before the new market was created continues on its route, and so does the trade cart trading with the farther market after the new one. Likewise, the cart trading with the new closer market will just keep doing what it's doing forever. Every market is independent, and adding a new one doesn't change existing routes, it just gives you a new option. Okay, so now what happens when you're the one building the new market along the route? Well, the new market makes the route shorter, and it drops the amount of gold that you get. The first cart keeps his gold from the long route, and the new cart, after the market is built, gets the lower amount of gold. Watch though, as the first cart goes all the way back to the further market with his more gold. The new cart has established his route with the new market. If only there was some way to get the first cart with more gold to drop it off at the new market. Would that work somehow? Maybe there's some way we can manipulate this so that he's carrying lots of gold from thinking he's trading with the far one and then drop it off at the close market. What if we build that closer market a lot closer too? Can we get big gold for a short distance at the cost of a market? So let's see. As it turns out, and this is probably for the best, you can't do that. As soon as I click on the closer market, he automatically drops 38 gold. It's a very clever game. What if we click back on the further market? Watch that, his gold switches back to how it was. There's a slight delay though, so let's see if we can capitalize on that and exploit it. It doesn't look like we can. It looks like the instant we click on a market, it automatically establishes that route and that length and that amount of gold. It's good to know that you can make the trade routes wherever you want and you don't have to worry about extraneous markets though, but it doesn't look like there's any exploit that we can get out of that. Alright, so now let's talk about trade cogs and trade carts. This one isn't asked too often, but I want to know which one's more profitable. Well, you may or may not know, trade cogs actually move faster, but on the flip side, the dock gives you less gold. Why must Age of Empires make everything so delightfully interesting for people who like math? The question is, do those two things completely balance out and you get the same gold from each? To test this out, I've set a trade route by land and sea that go right beside each other. I have the trade route yielding 100 gold, and I picked the market in that location so that it would do that. As you can see, the trade cog moves much faster and frequently laps the cart doing the same trip, but the cart is also getting more gold for every trip. We're going to have to let this run for a little while and see what kind of trend we get. I let the trade cart go for 4 loops, and so it will have collected 400 gold, and then I could compare that to the total amount of gold that both of them together got. I had to round a little bit, and it looks to me like the trade cog probably would have made another 5% of its route done maybe. But even so, in the time it took the cart to get 400 gold, the trade cog got 439. I was a little surprised about that, and yes, there is some rounding error, but it's clear that the trade cog performed better on a route of this length. This goes against what I thought was conventional wisdom, which was that the trade cogs actually get less gold than the trade carts, but maybe I've heard wrong. I also did a little experiment with the trade cog formula, and I'll have that up there, and as well, there it is compared to the trade cart formula. What I want to know though is why not get the best of both worlds and put a trade cart on a transport ship. It turns out that transport ships move a little bit faster than trade carts, and you can put trade carts onto transport ships. You know, I think we may actually pull this off. Well, not exactly. You see, you drop them off fine, but then when they pick up the gold, they just drop it before they can be loaded back into the cargo ship. It was worth a shot though. Theoretically, if it's a really windy route by land and a quick one by sea, you could actually carry your trade carts off, drop them off by the market, and then have them go back on land. Sounds like a lot of effort, but you know, it might actually pay off. Okay, so now let's look at market research. My question is, should you be getting Caravan? Yeah, I don't even have to test this one. It doubles your trade cart and trade cog speed, meaning you double the amount of gold that you get. It's like doubling the amount of carts you have for 200 wood and 200 gold. While we're on the topic of text from the market as well, let's look at coinage and banking and how that all works. Where trade refers to generating gold, the market is also a prerequisite for sending tribute to your allies or spamming taunt 38 to your computer teammates. Come on, you know you have. Okay, let's look at how many resources you have to plan to send in order to make these tribute techs worthwhile. Without either of these techs, you have to pay an extra 30% on top of all of your tributes. So if you send 100 food to your ally, they get 100, but it actually costs you 130. It's kind of a raw deal. Coinage costs 150 food and 50 gold, and it reduces that fee to 20%. That means you're saving 10% of everything you're sending. So you have to plan to send 1500 food and 500 gold, or something of equivalent value for you, in order for that to pay off. Bear in mind, your suffering ally also has to wait while you research it. If you're sending a bit of food over to help your ally advance a minute faster to Castle Age, don't bother with it, but if you're slinging, it goes without saying that this is something that you want to invest in. Okay, so what about banking? Well, it removes the tax entirely, meaning that it has double the savings of coinage. It also costs 200 food and 100 gold, so you'll want to get this if you plan on still sending another 1000 food and 500 gold, after which point the savings you get are greater than the cost of the tech. I realize you won't be sending a 2-to-1 ratio of food to gold, so that's a bit of a call you're going to have to make in-game. Depending on the map, different resources might be worth different things. So to summarize both of those techs together, if you're sending over 3,500 worth of resources to someone, it's worth investing the 500 resources to get both techs. As anything you tribute past 3,500, you save yourself some value. If you're not doing a huge tribute thing of more than 4,000 resources to another player, honestly just pay the fee and forget the research time. I've probably been a bit overzealous in the past with trying to save resources and be efficient, and I may or may not have ignored ally tribute requests when they needed them, because I wanted to research banking and not lose resources. Remember that the timing in which you get resources can actually be more important than the number of resources you get. Just something to think about. Okay, so now let's look at buying and selling resources at the market. I used to be convinced that the price of goods was somehow influenced by the amount of that resource that had been gathered. I noticed every late game that the price of food and wood was really low, and I thought that this was mimicking supply and demand. I'm pretty convinced now that that's not the case though, and other people in the game were using the markets, and I was just out of the loop about how good buying and selling is. First off, you know me, I want to know the formula for buying and selling price. Okay, so let's look at food. At 130 being the cost of gold that it takes to buy 100 food, and 70 being the amount of gold you get for selling 100 food, it kind of looks like the formula is the selling price times 2 minus 10. Let's see if that holds up. But then when you sell a bunch, it looks like you take the selling price times 2 and subtract 2. Okay, so it's a little bit more complicated than some simple formula like that. As we increase the buying, we see that it's clearly not a multiplying and subtracting something else, as the difference between them becomes bigger and bigger. It looks more like it's following a ratio. So after maxing out the buying of stone at a price of 12,999 to buy 100 stone, and selling 100 stone for 6,999 gold, I found the decimal ratio between those numbers, and I tried playing around with it until I found a nice ratio that I think it sounds like they were probably using. The closest ratio I could find, which was actually pretty darn close, was 13/7. I was proud of this at the time because it was working for all of the different ratios that I was doing. Whatever the selling price was, I divide it by 7 and multiply it by 13, and it always gave me the buying price. Then I realized, after that brute force math method, that the game is actually working on a 30% commodity trading fee, and that suddenly made everything make a whole lot more sense. That means that there's a real price of the resource. Food and wood apparently start off as being 100 gold for 100 of one of those resources at the market. What happens with the buying price is the buying price is 30% higher than that, whereas the selling price is 30% lower than that. That's why I got my 13:7 ratio. What this also means is that the amount that something costs to buy in Feudal Age, for all civs except the Saracens, will be 85.7% greater than its selling price, and this trend continues for all the prices that we observe. I want to make sure you're clear on this whole hidden price, real value of it thing though before I move on. The idea is there's like a fair exchange rate between the two, between gold and one of the resources, and they're all independent. You don't actually see that value, you just see 30% higher than that and 30% lower than that, and that's what that buy and sell numbers are. The real hidden price is always going to be exactly in the middle of those. Of course, as we buy and sell, that price changes, and how fast, I wondered. So, if we play around with it and we determine the new hidden real price, we see that it changes by intervals of 3, and that if we buy and then sell, we get back the exact same price we had originally. Bear in mind, this is also a global price, so if the enemy is using the market, that will affect the prices as well. In math, we say this is something that's quantized because only certain values are achievable. We could say that you move up and down on predictable intervals of 3. The only exception is at the lowest price. The real price drops from 100 go on intervals of 3 until it reaches 22 gold, then the last one moves it down to 20, then it stays at 20. The real value for it will never be less than 20. However, if it's 100 food for 20 gold and you try to sell more food, you're not going to get that 20, you get 30% less than that, you get 14. If you then start buying when it's at the bottom, it moves up again on intervals of 3, but this time it hits different numbers on the way up, because going up by intervals of 3 from 20 doesn't give you the same set of numbers as going down intervals of 3 from 100. Remember, I'm not saying the selling price you see is going down by 3 every time. The number that's going down is one that you can't see. The ones that you do see are 30% higher and lower than that invisible number. That's why, depending on the way it rounds, those numbers that you actually see can go up and down by 2, 3, and 4, and it seems kind of random. Okay, so we know the minimum value for a resource is 20 gold for 100 of it, but is there a maximum? Well, it turns out that without guilds, the maximum fee you can pay is 12,999 to buy 100 of the resource. That is unachievable by normal means, and I could only do it by using triggers that constantly pay me more gold. That means the market value is about 10,000. This is also theoretical though, let's try to tie it back to reality. What you really want to know is how good is it to sell resources at the market? Well, if you sell food from its starting value of 70 gold per 100 food down to the bottom of 14 gold per 100 food, in that process you traded 2,700 food for 1,155 gold. That's not too shabby, and it sounds like a pretty good trade actually. Gold is so important in the late game and opens so many more options in Imperial Age that I would often be happy to make that exchange. You can see the loss though if you try to buy your way back up. You only get to a hidden price of 74, which is a ways away from the 100 you started with. Now let's look at how good of a deal it is to go up if you have lots of gold but not a lot of resources. If you run out of food or wood in the late game and the market price is at rock bottom, you only need to spend 4,246 gold to get a little over 4,100 of that resource back. Again, good deal if you have an abundance of gold. More likely though, it's gold that you want and not what you have. So what if someone's beat you to selling off their food or wood and it's already at rock bottom prices? You still need gold, but I'll tell you what, it's really not that great anymore. At a selling price of 14, you're giving 5,000 wood or food for 700 gold. That works out to 7,142 wood or food for 1,000 gold. Not a great deal, but it does work in a pinch. Remember, the market also has no memory of when you overshoot the lowest price. So if you sell thousands of resources for 14 gold for 100 of that resource, and then someone else buys on that resource once, it moves up a bit again. You want to sell a resource right after a lot of other people have bought it and they've brought the price up. Not that you can usually predict that sort of thing, but the market ward starts to come into play during long water games where balancing wood and gold to keep galleon production can have a big influence on market prices. If you can, you want to make sure you're paying attention to the market to try and capitalize on that balance that the other player's trying to do as well. Okay, so that's all assuming that you're playing as the Japanese, the Aztecs, Chinese, Franks, Mongols, Vikings, Incas, Indians, Magyars, or Slavs, and you don't get guilds. You're stuck at a 30% commodity trading fee. What about if you do have guilds? Well, guilds reduces that trading fee of 30% down to 15. That's a pretty good deal if you plan to use the market, and that does change the rate from 26/14 to 23/17. Now if you sell your resources from the top to the bottom, it gives you 1400 gold instead of 1155 that you would have had without guilds. After that point, if you continue selling, 7000 food or wood gets you 1190 gold. So that's a ratio of 5882 wood or food for each 1000 gold you make, saving you significant resources from the 7142 wood or food without guilds that it takes to get that same gold. Okay, so it all sounds better, but it still doesn't sound like a great deal. What we want to know though is how much do you have to use it before it pays off? Well, that's a bit of a tricky one again, because the prices are constantly moving around. Bear in mind that it's 300 food and 200 gold to research guilds, so we'll just say that it costs 500 resources. Since it changes the commodity trading fee by 15%, I think we can just divide 500 by 0.15 to get an answer, but it's a little hard to interpret. That gives us 3,333, which represents something, I'm sure of it. I think what it's saying is that if the sum of all of the true prices when you buy and sell, if all of those total more than 3,333, then it's worth getting guilds. This is one of the reasons that I really wanted to make sure you understood this idea of the true or hidden price, because now we're talking about trading with it. Think about it, if you're going to pay 12,995 to get 100 stone, it's worth spending the 500 resources to get guilds, as you'll save 1,500 resources on that one purchase of selling. It's worth spending 500 resources to get guilds, as you'll save 1,500 resources on that one purchase. If, on the other hand, you're selling 100 food for 14 gold though, it's not worth changing that to 17 gold. You're saving 3 resources and spending 500 to get guilds. You'd have to sell 100 food 167 times to pay off guilds. We want the total amount that we end up saving being the 500 for that cost of guilds, and since we're only saving 15% of the true price, each time we use the market, we want all those 15% of the true price to add up to 500. It doesn't matter if we buy or sell, or if we're doing a combination of the two. I hope I've sold you on that interpretation. The more I think about it, the more sense it makes, but I'm not sure if that's always a good thing. Okay, so now let's try it in game, just to be sure. So I'm going to buy 5 times, sell 10 times, and then buy 5 times again. I'm going to do it with guilds and without guilds, and we're going to see if guilds ends up paying off. We know that guilds would automatically be better than not having guilds, so we're going to include the cost of researching guilds at the start, and we're going to factor that into the results. This seems like a decent amount of market usage, and I end up being out 571 gold without guilds. Now if we do it with guilds, that turns into 470 gold, but remember, we're also short 300 food still. If we buy back that 300 food, we've now spent 825 gold, because that includes resources to research. It doesn't look like using the market on this scale would justify getting guilds. So the question now is, when should you use guilds? Well, how about this situation? You have 27,000 food and wood and 225 gold. You want to get as much gold as you can for your military because it's a 1 vs 1 game with no trade and all the gold has been mined. The pressure is on. Gold is worth a lot to you right now, and your 60 farmers and 50 lumberjacks make food and wood almost worthless to you. So should you get guilds in this situation? Well, without guilds, you can sell all but 5,000 of your food and wood and you get 6,385 gold. That's 44,000 resources for about 6,000 gold, but that might be worth it in an actual game. Now let's research guilds and do it again. Do you think those 3 gold savings every time will add up? Well, we do the same thing, bearing in mind that guilds takes a bit of time to research, but you end up with 7,454 resources. That's a cool 17% more gold than without guilds. Still, that's a brutal cost of 44,000 food and wood for less than 7,500 gold, but in this case it did pay off by 1,049 gold in the end. That's nothing to scoff at, so keep that in mind. Obviously that's an extreme use of the market, but it does show that sometimes guilds isn't completely useless. Okay, so now let's look at the special case, and that's the Saracens. Remember the other exchange ratios of 26/14 and 23/17? Well, for the Saracens it's 21/19. That's almost even. Instead of a 30% fee on top of the true price, it's 5%. How crazy is that? This is why the Saracens are considered a dark horse threat for scout and monk rushes at insane feudal times. They can exchange resources at the market in a very surprisingly efficient way. It takes them the same number of cells to reach the bottom prices, as their market is still based on the hidden true market value that I've been talking about, but their lowest price is 19, not 14. They similarly get a much larger payoff from selling resources all the way down. Selling from start to the bottom as the Saracens gives you 1,565 gold instead of the usual 1,155 that it does for other civilizations. That's pretty slick. After that, you get 950 gold for every 5,000 resources that you sell at the bottom. That works out to 5,263 resources for 1,000 gold instead of the normal 7,142 for civs without guilds and 5,882 for civilizations with guilds. As a Saracen player early in the game, economy balance should not be a problem for you. All players should use the market to readjust their economy, sure, especially if it's poorly set up, but Saracens are just that much more viable. It's a nice bonus that newer players don't know about, and it makes the Saracens a bit more dangerous than they might seem. Also bear in mind other civilizations don't even get guilds until the late game, and have to spend 500 resources to research it. Saracens get a way better bonus, and they get it from the start of the game, which allows a number of strategies to become more viable early in the game. A Saracen player selling stone early in the game can net them over 300 gold for their initial 200 stone, which isn't too shabby as long as you're okay delaying extra town centers or putting some extra villagers on stone early. It makes more sense to me for Saracens to mine stone early on and sell it rather than mining gold, as weird as that sounds. Gold is gathered about 6% faster than stone early on, but selling stone at a market value of 158 gold for 100 stone way more than makes up for that. It's unorthodox, but for the first 1,000 stone, it's a really good deal. Obviously, stone is a finite resource, so you may have a castle crunch in the late game, but the extra resources early on might help you end the whole game a lot sooner. Alright, shifting gears now back to markets. What happens when markets are destroyed? I left this one to the end because no one has asked about this, but I think it's good to know just the same. So let's do this with some different scenarios and we'll follow the trade cards. First, what if you're trading with your allies' market and it's destroyed? Well, even if they have another one, your guys still go right back to yours and chill out. You have to tell them to trade with the new one. Yikes, so it sounds like attacking somebody's market can seriously mess up the other player's trade route. Now what happens if we restart that and this time do something a bit different? Now let's destroy our own home market, assuming that you have another one. In this case, the trade cards actually just carry on and they start trading with your other market. They're smarter when it's one of yours that's being destroyed than when it's one of your allies. Now let's test it again, but this time I'm going to delete both of my markets. This confuses the trade carts and they stop where they are, dropping all of their gold. I can make a new market though. Unfortunately, they don't start the new trade route automatically, but if I tell them to go to the ally market, then they'll start up again, no problem. I can keep making extra markets for safety, and even when one of mine is destroyed, they just pick another one to trade with. What if I have more than two though? How do they pick which market they're going to trade with when the one they're currently trading with is destroyed? So to test this, I've added a few different markets, one closest to my ally market, right beside it, one close to the one that I'm destroying, and one close to where the trade carts are, and then one more that I didn't think they would pick that's as far away from possible that would give the most efficient route. Which one will they prefer when I delete the market they're currently using? It turns out that they established the new route with whichever market was closest to them when the old market was destroyed. Theoretically, if the carts aren't all bunched up like this, then you could actually split them into new market trade routes with different markets depending on whichever one they happen to be closest to. Pretty cool stuff. So I have a couple more tips to finish up this video related to the market that I want to mention. First, some of you may not know this, but you can actually trade with enemies. There's rumors out there that this leads to more gold, however, as we can see, it doesn't actually change it at all. This is going to be a lot easier to do if you've already killed that enemy or they've resigned the game and just left their market open for you to trade with. However, something else that's probably good to know is you can actually destroy your allies' stuff after they've resigned the game. If they have a wall or a building that's in your way, or if your enemies are trading with your allies' old market, you can actually just click on it and delete it. You can't do that though while your ally is still playing the game. Another tip for you is a fast way to sell markets is to hold down shift as you interact with it, and it lets you sell in groups of 5 instead of 1 at a time. I also recommend trying to use the market to sell your resources before your enemy does. Remember that it's a global market and everyone's activity at the market affects everyone else's. The first bit of food and wood that you sell gives you a really good price, so capitalize on that early if you can. This tip may not be super helpful for you, but trade carts are one of the few units that are not attacked when someone has a neutral stance with you. That might be a good thing to know for diplomacy maps, but don't trust too many of your valuable trade carts in someone's base if you don't know what their intentions are. As well, before you ask, I would say the optimal time to start trading is basically whenever you can spare the resources. You should be building the trade over time and not waiting until the map runs completely out of gold though. This is something you should be getting at kind of as early as possible, but maybe wait till mid-castle age. On a similar line of thought, make sure you build multiple markets to get trade carts faster and avoid pathing issues if one of them is destroyed. Also bear in mind that with long trade routes, it can be a lot harder for you to defend it. It's a better gold payment, yes, but it's not worth throwing away trade carts over. One thing I've seen people do that seems kinda clever is in a high population game, put a few monks beside the market to heal team trade carts as they pass by. The most important tip I can give you as well is to protect that trade line. Put it somewhere you think you can stop it from being raided. In the late game, it can be your only gold income besides maybe relics. Gold is necessary for so many units you have to make, so you gotta keep that steady stream of gold coming in if you want to keep a steady stream of good units going out. So that wraps up all the questions that I've gotten, plus a bunch more of my own. I was thinking about making follow-ups to my videos in the future to handle any oversights and concerns that people have, so it's probably worth leaving a comment for any other market questions you have, and they may get incorporated into a future video about markets that ties up any of the loose ends here. I hope this satisfied your curiosity for the most part and gave you something to think about going into your next game. I apologize for the long video, I know it was a lot in one sitting, and I appreciate those of you who stuck around for the whole thing. Until next time, guys.